Oregon is expected to enact the nation's first statewide rent control law in response to rapidly rising housing costs. Other states are watching closely. Portland, Oregon. Andy Mangels had been living in his modest apartment near downtown Portland, Oregon, for 3 decades when the news arrived a few days before Christmas. His rent was being raised by 113%. Now Mr. Mangels, 52, has a little more than a month to find a new place in the city's supercharged rental housing market, where median rents have risen 30% since 2011, adjusted for inflation, and the sight of people living out of cars or in tents pitched alongside highways has become common. In an effort to halt runaway housing costs and curtail evictions, Oregon is expected this week to become the first state in the nation to cap how much landlords can raise rents. As early as Monday, the state House of Representatives is likely to pass rent control legislation that has already been approved by the state Senate. Governor Kate Brown, a Democrat, has said she will sign it. The legislation comes as states and cities around the nation search desperately for answers to a growing crisis in which rising rents have outstripped wages. Nationwide, median rents have surpassed $1,000 since 2006. In states with capitals controlled by Democrats, like Oregon, leaders are pushing laws that would limit rent increases, over the objections of landlords who say the rules would threaten their livelihoods. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, has called for $1 billion in tax credits and new home construction to aid middle-class home buyers, and the state legislature is mulling its own plans to stabilize the state's overheated rental housing market. Illinois is contemplating ending a statewide ban on local rent control laws, and in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo, a Democrat, has said he intends to strengthen existing rent regulations to keep apartment prices stable. 3/4 of the nation's mayors say that a lack of affordable housing is a significant concern in their cities. Boston is proposing steep taxes on developers. Denver is studying proposals to allow more carriage houses, detached separate living units on the same lot as a house, which are far cheaper to build than typical single-family residences. In the 1980s and 1990s, many states began banning cities from setting local limits on rent increases, encouraged in part by the American Legislative Exchange Council, which advocates laws that limit government and boost free markets. Oregon would become the first state to impose a statewide rent control policy, but such rules have been common for decades in large American cities, including New York, Washington, Los Angeles and San Francisco. In the Portland metropolitan area, which is growing by more than 30,000 people a year, the housing problem is especially acute. But the problem has spread beyond Portland, the state's largest city with 650,000 residents, as the median rent has increased by more than 14% statewide in recent years. In Talent, a city of 6,500 in southern Oregon, 1 in 3 residents spends more than half of his or her income on housing. Rents in Bend, one of the 10 fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the nation, have climbed by more than 21% in the last 3 years. In Medford, the rental vacancy rate is less than 2%. And students at the University of Oregon in Eugene say pricey apartments have forced them to live in towns as far as an hour's drive from campus. Mark Gamba, mayor of Milwaukee, a suburb of Portland, said the desperation among tenants there was palpable. Tourniquets like this are needed to stop the bleeding, he said of the state rent control legislation. Still, some landlords say that the legislation will compel owners to take their properties off the rental market because they will no longer be able to earn enough rent from them, deepening the housing crisis rather than easing it. Rent control is not going to work over the long haul, said John DiLorenzo, who owns about 240 apartment units and is a lobbyist for landlords. Mr. DiLorenzo said his primary fear was that lawmakers would ultimately bar rents from rising more than a bare minimum, which would prevent landlords from meeting their expenses and eventually drive them out of business. The real solution to rising rents, he said, is to make it easier to build decent and affordable housing in Oregon by eliminating a multitude of fees and regulations. Even so, some of the state's largest property owners groups have chosen not to oppose the bill, and are remaining neutral instead, saying that they recognize the scope of the housing problem. "I do not believe it will be catastrophic to our livelihood," said Jim Straub, legislative director of the Oregon Rental Housing Association. The legislation would limit rent increases to 7% annually plus the change in the Consumer Price Index, which is currently rising about 3% a year. Apartment buildings with fewer than 5 units would be exempt, as would housing complexes that are less than 15 years old. The bill would also sharply reduce the circumstances in which tenants can be evicted. Even as the state's economy hums along, with unemployment at only 4%, Oregon has been unable to significantly chip away at its stubbornly high 16.5% poverty rate. Wages have not kept pace with housing costs. In an interview, Governor Brown said the popularity of the state with newcomers, many of whom earn high wages, has been a mixed blessing. "The rental market is extremely tight," she said. "We have a lot of families that are vulnerable, and landlords want to evict them and bring in higher-paying tenants." Portland, the epicenter of the state's crisis, has independently enacted some of the nation's strongest tenant protections. One law requires landlords to pay moving costs of up to $4,500 if they evict people without providing a reason, or if they raise rents more than 10%. Portland has been short of affordable housing for a long time.